back, everybody, to the TSV podcast. It's been a while since you've heard from me. Like many of you, 2020 was an unpredictable and somewhat chaotic year. Me, more or less, losing the ability to sit down and have long form recorded conversations for the podcast. So that's why you haven't heard many of those in quite a while. But we're back in action. I've moved locations. We have a new room for the studio for dedicated recordings. So you can expect to see or hear a lot more from us soon. And most of you are probably listening to this on audio through whatever podcast app that you listen to the show on. But I also want to let you know that as of this episode, we're firing up a YouTube channel. So we're going to start doing video in addition to the audio. I'll post a link to that YouTube channel in the show notes. And so everything will start being posted there as well if you want to follow along for the video conversations. So yeah, that's just a little bit of housekeeping from me today. I'm excited to get right into today's episode. I am here with the managing editor and editor-in-chief, Tivy and Ash Milton from Palladium Magazine. Some of you will know that Wolf and I have actually collaborated before. He was a contributor to issue 3 of the Sideview Journal back in the before times when we could congregate and meet people in real life. I also had a chance to meet him down at the Interval in San Francisco. So we've had a chance to have a few good conversations and just share a little bit about our experiences creating these sort of new media publishing podcast companies and organizations online. So I'm really excited to sit down and chat with them. Some of you will already know about Palladium because of our previous work together, but for those of you who don't know, I just wanted to read for you a little bit about their About page, because I think if you're interested in the side view, you're also going to be interested in Palladium, not just from the standpoint of their content, which is very good, but also the attitude that they're bringing to this publication. So here's what they have written on their About page. They say, Palladium Magazine is a nonpartisan publication that explores the future of liberalism, governance, and society through responsible, slow publishing, long-form analysis, political theory, and investigative journalism. Jonah Bennett and Wolf Tivy co-founded Palladium Magazine in September 2018 to produce the high-quality, hard-hitting work needed in a time of institutional sclerosis, political upheaval, and dearth of original thought. So with that introduction, I want to welcome Wolf Tivy and Ash Milton. Welcome, gentlemen.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having us.
So I thought we could start with just a little bit of background. You know, the website at this point, you have a lot of content up there already, a lot of articles you've published, podcast episodes. I know as part of your sort of subscriber community, you also host salons and discussions and things like that. So there's a lot going on there. But I thought we should start with just taking a few steps back and kind of taking us to just whatever that moment is right before you created Palladium. Where were you? What were you doing? Why did you think Palladium was the right thing to create? And sort of what were the things that fed into that need to bring this into the world?
Right. I mean, I can tell the story of it. I'd finally convinced Jonah to escape from Washington, D.C. and come join me in the Bay Area to kind of work on ideas. Basically, we'd been intellectual collaborators for a long time, just talking about what's going on in the world, how society works, and had sort of settled on a view of that there's something wrong with our intellectual paradigm for understanding society and how to do society. You know, with Palladium, we've sort of summarized that as liberalism has reached the end of its life cycle. We need to come to some kind of post-liberalism. We came up with the idea of the post-liberal synthesis, but basically through 2018, we'd been talking about maybe starting a magazine to serve as the center of a conversation that we wanted to see in the world, which was a more high quality out there, but still responsible conversation about some of these governance issues that we were seeing. And we saw that there was a lot of people interested in this stuff. There was a lot of need for it, but there wasn't really anything servicing that need except for various low quality conversations on the internet. And we thought, okay, let's bring a little bit more rigor to this. Let's put a real stake in this space and try to build a new conversation around this. And so we came up with the idea of Palladium Magazine to do that. We got some friends together to help write for us, and we launched in September and had a big party, and it was a blast. And Palladium's just been kind of growing ever since, picking up new friends, picking up new writers, picking up new ideas. And that basic idea is still there, right? We're trying to build this new conversation around essentially what comes after the current paradigm. I think we can all see by this point, in 2018, maybe it was a little bit avant-garde to say this, but I think by now, people can see that the paradigm is failing, that it has really reached its conceptual limits. And
2018 was a crisis without seriousness, essentially. People talked about crisis and paradigm change and everything, but I think there was almost no real thought being put into it, frankly.
Yeah.
It's different now.
Yeah, so that was the story with Jonah and I. And of course, Ash had been a friend of ours for a long time, and we brought him in pretty early to just help us out with the editing and so on. And over time, Ash and I have sort of become the core of the thing, and Jonah decided to go work on some other stuff for a while. And so that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, at the time that it started, I remember I had just moved to Toronto, which is where I'm still based. It's kind of an interesting city here. It's very much, there's a corridor between this city and the Bay Area. In happier times, I was traveling that corridor quite frequently. Hopefully, we'll get to again. But I had just finished working. I'd worked for a couple of years as a market analyst in medical tech. Looking at medical tech markets. I had finished studying economics in undergrad in Vancouver. And I think at that time, I was starting to see some of what we were talking about. I think people understood more at that point than they had really through the 2010s. You know, I was kind of finishing high school, I was going through undergrad in the 2010s. And I think there was a sense that kind of things had started to stagnate. Obviously, by 2016, I think that occurred to a lot of people, but as I said, it didn't seem serious as yet. And for my part, I thought that it was long past time that we had an actual attempt at figuring out what exactly was going wrong. I think people were falling back on a lot of outmoded ways of looking at this. You know, the problem was just polarization, or the problem was, you know, we just had to go back to some magical year when things were still working, or we had to, you know, we needed better functioning institutions. That is a little more correct, but it doesn't really answer why things had failed and when they had failed and how. And so I think we basically agreed that there needed to be a project which was willing to engage a number of, let's say, a number of lenses about this thing. I mean, you know, Palladium has always published very diverse perspectives in terms of our analysis, but it had to be a project that was not constrained by any of them. It had to have its own vision, its own ethos. And I think that that's something we've definitely achieved well in the last few years. So, and especially with the first print coming out now, I'm very pleased on the aesthetic and material level, even how that's manifested.
Yeah, I mean, about that diversity of perspectives thing, there's multiple ways to do that. One way is just kind of have people bring in whatever ideas they have beforehand, and they can, you know, say it on our platform. That's not how we do it. The way we do it is we launched with that article towards the post-liberal synthesis, where we actually laid out a methodology of what we were going to be doing, which was, you can bring all these perspectives, you can bring almost any perspective here, but we insist on kind of taking those things apart and taking the parts of them that work and can be added to our conversation and bringing them in as little pieces of addition towards the project of governance futurism. And like this is the central idea of synthesis, right? We're taking these ideas and we're trying to take them apart and put them back together into something better. We're not just having, some dialogue for the sake of dialogue. We are actually trying to build a worldview here. And our view is that many different traditions, many different viewpoints have something to offer, but they have to actually, it has to go through this sort of disciplined process of removing those insights from the particular context and being able to have them, say, expressed in a way that's compatible with the insights from other ideas and so on. So that's what we've been trying to hold up in our editorial process. Is when people bring us these ideas, we try to okay, that's too much of just kind of baggage from your particular worldview, but here's the insights. We'll take those, we'll translate them into governance futurism, and we're building this new thing.
Yeah, I mean, importantly, I think it's not just the case that we want our writers being in dialogue with one another, although they should be. They also, in a sense, need to be in dialogue with us. And, anyone who's submitted to us or we've worked with on editing kind of knows we're quite interventionist in how we try to get writers to express a thesis. I think, one of the worst things for any writer is having been in academia. I think academia actively kills good writing and the ability to make arguments. It trains you really well how to hedge arguments, but that's a very different thing from making arguments. And so, you kind of have to, I've sort of joked before that many times it's the people with PhDs who we kind of have to deprogram the most. And, some of our best articles have been written by college and even high school dropouts. So, I think that basically what we try and do in the process of that dialectic is ourselves have good theory chops and do a lot of internal development. We have a lot of internal discussions. We have community salons. We'll have private labs sometimes with writers, build up our internal understanding of the thing, and then kind of push writers to strongly, boldly express what they think, being to risk being wrong, and then develop a real coherent framework in your piece. And when you engage with us in that way, I think that's where some of our best work comes from.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to so many of the threads that you both just threw up, especially this conversation around what is the audience for like a magazine like Palladium. This is something that I've encountered with the side view as well, where you want to bring all of that sort of cognitive horsepower that comes with a traditional PhD or traditional graduate school education and make it you don't want to water it down, right? But you want to create some on-ramps so that people who don't have that background can kind of participate in the conversation and maybe be directed to some of those deeper sources, some of those other conversations, or just, make them aware that they're happening and that these are things that other people might want to know about. But just in terms of kind of like throwing a little bit more color on the painting that you're building here, let's talk about some of these core concepts that I'm learning Palladium is organized around. One you mentioned was liberalism and a kind of a post-liberalism. And the other one was governance futurism, which is right there on your homepage. So let's spend a little bit more time talking about these ideas. Like, what, in your view, when you say liberalism, what do you mean more specifically? And what's happened to it? Why has it run aground? Why do we need a post-liberal synthesis? What does that look like? Can you take us through the transition from the one to the other a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I can tackle that. I mean, these defining exactly what liberalism is going to be a little bit difficult. This is a bit of a disclaimer, because it's a little bit like a fish in water situation. It's the society that we live in. It's the set of assumptions that really govern how we do society, how we think about society. It's not always entirely visible, and our understanding has kind of become more sophisticated even since the founding of the magazine. One way to think about it is there are coordination mechanisms available to humans, various ways of organizing ourselves, ideas like personal interest, ideas like solidarity, ideas like contracts, ideas like friendship or family or ethnic concerns or religious concerns, or all these different ways that people have organized themselves throughout history. And liberalism, which is to say kind of the paradigm of our modern society, has essentially chosen a few of these coordination mechanisms and said, okay, we're going to do things within these coordination mechanisms and within this ontology. And we're more or less going to not do things outside of that. And we're going to be suspicious of things outside of that. And, some of these coordination mechanisms that liberalism is very comfortable with are things like personal interest on the market, things like, financial interest in particular, things like bureaucracy, having this professionalized bureaucracy, things like democracy, and the moral primacy of the individual, even the ontological primacy of the individual, things like that. And then of course you have all this around that. You have all this discourse about rights, discourse about freedoms. So that's sort of broadly throwing some darts at the current paradigm, which we're calling liberalism. As for how it's run aground, I think there's a few things going on. One of which is the most general, I guess, is that whenever you have an approach, some paradigm with which you're approaching the world, and your paradigm is acting on the thing that it is theorizing about, like with society, you're going to go along in the direction implied by that paradigm for a while. And at some point, you actually run out of problems and solutions that actually work with that paradigm. You almost, like, if you think of it as sort of gradient descent sort of process in machine learning or something, it's like you pick a vector, you move along the vector for a while. At some point, the function stops decreasing along that vector, and then you have to change what direction you're going. And I think this is something that happens in human society as well. We pick a vector of development. We pick, okay, we're going to really focus on these issues, on these coordination mechanisms, on these ontologies for a while. And you kind of like exhaust the things that are possible within that ontology. And at some point you reach the point where you've run into a bunch of problems, perhaps because of your success, where that ontology is no longer fit for those problems. And you have to step back. You have to think outside the box at that point and say, okay, well, what's our new direction? What are the actual problems we face? Where we need to be going for the next 200 years, or the next whatever time period? It's the same thing like in business strategy, right? It's like you do a sprint for a year. It's like we're solving this problem, and then you do another big strategy session. You're thinking, okay, well, where are we going? So the basic idea with the post-liberal synthesis and with the sort of end of liberalism is like, hey, maybe we've reached the limits of this paradigm, and we need to just have that moment of stepping back, stepping outside of our paradigms, breaking down our assumptions, actively abusing our concepts, and kind of settle into a new direction. And so our thesis is that we're at that time right now, that we need to be breaking out of the current paradigm and setting our new paradigm, because it's a direction change, basically to tackle the problems that have been coming up over the last few hundred years that we have not had the paradigm that our paradigm has just been kind of piling up but not fixing. So that's the first way that something can be exhausted. The second way is, I think, institutions can just decay. So you have things are set up a certain way. You don't always get the succession right. The various parasitical processes in society kind of build up in response to whatever you were doing, and the thing decays in its usefulness just from sort of a structural perspective. Its institutions become dysfunctional, and this is just something that's completely universal to human societies. You always have this decay process of institutions, and then someone has to kind of refound the thing. And so I think there's that going on as well. We've undergone a lot of decay, and I think so. This is visible in things like, do the people in charge actually care about the things that people cared about when our paradigm was set up? Like, are they caring about building a powerful society, building a strong society? Are they caring about some kind of notion of solidarity with each other and pushing forward on some vision of the future? Or is it more like they've just kind of got a position, they've got a paradigm, they're defending it, they don't really know what's going on anymore? And so our thesis is like it's become more of the latter. And this has been a sort of evolution decay process over time. And that's just kind of inevitable. So that's another way that you occasionally need these refounding moments to kind of build on what has been done, but very fresh. You need something fresh. The third thing I would say is that we do actually sort of critique liberalism from a fundamental perspective. Like, we think maybe it was useful for a time, but it is not correct. It may not have even been a good idea. We're a little bit agnostic on that. We'll take multiple perspectives there, but we're open to the idea that the whole idea actually had some critical flaws from the beginning, and it's maybe just taken us a while to manifest those fully, or maybe they've been manifesting all along, and it's just time to get out of this paradigm and fix those flaws. So that's sort of like three different ways that we approach this issue of liberalism and the post-liberal synthesis. I haven't answered your question about governance futurism yet, but I'll just leave it at that. It's kind of liberalism and post-liberal synthesis.
I wanted to jump in there. On the last thought, especially, notably when it comes to the ideological content of liberalism, this is something that has fluctuated immensely over the last 150, 200 years.
Right.
Even specifically American liberalism has fluctuated. The content has updated even in the last 10 years. And so when you're talking about the output, essentially, of a political order, in some sense, it's very obvious that this is downstream of a bunch of other stuff: institutional concerns, power concerns, structures of production and management of the society and class structures, a lot of different things. And so when we talk about liberalism as an ideological idea, as Wolf has kind of laid this out quite well, the ideological content is something we see as downstream of the structures of the political order itself. That's not to say that it's just kind of a lie or an illusion. That's not really how that kind of thing works. It's what we get is a power structure trying to make sense of itself and the world around it. It will tell certain stories about how it came to be and why it's legitimate. It will promote certain thinkers in that order, and that's the process of how this thing updates. Mm-hmm. But in this particular political order we live in, it's clear that there have been certain consistencies, again, some of which we laid out here, right? The civic individual, the kind of public cooperative state, like rights-bearing citizenry, and so on and so forth, the idea of progress. Some of these things seem to be quite correct. Some of them are easier to critique. One, for example, that I think we've critiqued pretty strongly would be the niceties of how social contracts are considered in liberalism, and the kind of highly individualistic way that they get expressed in its ontology of how society works, especially the idea of a pre-political society. But in that being said, then, we live as part of that society. We live under that regime of power. And I don't think it's the case that you can just kind of, maybe abstractly as a thought experiment, you can play with, what if history had gone in a different direction? What if you can just change all the ideas? I think one of the outputs of what I've just said is that actually getting the correct ideas is important, but it doesn't actually take one as far as a lot of people might assume. You actually need to think about where those ideas are coming from and how to update those structures, those social technologies. And when we've discussed post-liberalism, part of the way we use that term was very open-ended. The post is doing a lot of work, essentially. We know that there are other paradigms opening up here. We're seeing a bunch of them in the world, but we don't necessarily know what they're going to look like. It may be that what's being proposed right now, both within and outside the liberal order, don't actually turn out that way, right? They might have their own weird internal logics that end up playing out. And so we kind of just opened up that idea that there might be other forms of legitimacy and regime types out there that are rising that we don't know about. I think in practical terms, the term post-liberal was one that a lot of different groups started using. A lot of them started attaching a lot more ideological content to it than we were. And so I think the term is still useful, but in practice, that's also why the governance futurism idea has become more and more central to us. I think that it ended up more accurately highlighting what we were trying to do, and maybe being a little more faithful to the Bay Area spirit that we founded the thing on, right? Where what the Bay Area has done for a lot of technologies, or at least what the ideal of the Bay Area has been, that's something we're trying to apply to governance. And so like that forward-looking aspect, I think is better expressed in the governance futurism concept. And that's something that we've started more consistently referring ourselves back to in terms of the project, the community, the movement around it, and so on.
Yeah, so governance futurism, if we want to understand governance futurism, it's a methodology, it's a project, it's sort of we're not trying to present it as, oh, we've got this finished idea, right? We're presenting it as, we are doing governance futurism. This is something we're doing. Maybe we're doing it together as a movement, but it's this ongoing process of trying to discover what is the future of governance and trying to build what is the future of governance. And just one more point on, just to respond to Ash's point about sort of this relationship between structure and ideology. The ideology only really kind of comes into play embodied in structure. So it's really the social structures that are driving things, but those social structures are understood reflectively by themselves, by their participants, by the elites who kind of create them. And that understanding is, of course, done through ideas. So if you can, I think there is a big opportunity to, if we can come in and work on the level of ideas, we can offer patches on the level of ideas that can help us start to imagine new social structures and build new social structures. But then, of course, the actual work of performing an update on the ideology of society is, of course, one of actual institution building. It's like, you can sit there and imagine a piece of software, but it's not real until you've built a piece of software. And that's this like more embodied process. And I think it's similar in human society. Anyways, just adding something to what Ash was saying.
You can't just negate it either, right? So when we say post, it is opposed to anti. Obviously
right.
Our society got a bunch of things correct, or else it would not have functioned at all. It just may be that some of those observations no longer hold, or maybe it was not accurate in self-assessing some of its own assumptions. We have to figure out what our society did right, because obviously we have actually engendered a lot of progress over the last couple hundred years, material and social progress. And the idea of a post-liberal analysis is one that figures out how we can move to a paradigm which doesn't reject the positive content, the right order, the good stuff in the old one. It actually should, in a way, properly order them, right? Make them function more honestly and in a more beneficial way than they have been. So that's something else I want to add there.
Yeah, that's where my thoughts were going to, and I've had the similar set of thoughts reading Palladium, but also reading just kind of other people writing in this space, writing about the future. Everybody can look out and kind of sense that the primary navigation functions of our liberal society are damaged or in need of renewal. Something needs to happen, and therein, I think, lies both the great promise, but also the great risk. You've both been saying that there's a tremendous amount that liberalism as a philosophy and as a form of sort of material social organization, there's a tremendous amount of good that it's done. There's a tremendous amount of, the enshrining of rights, like especially rights of the individual, all of those things that people think of as, positive associations with liberalism, things that we want to hold on to. And now in this moment of kind of crisis or turning, we're kind of seeing that, well, a lot of these aspects of liberal society are vulnerable and susceptible to capture. And when that happens, you need to do something. You need to step in and intervene and create something new. The risk, I think, is that what could come in to take its place, and I think a lot of people are feeling this anxiety right now because they know that there's aspects of our society that are, they're really on the chopping block right now. There's a real debate about how to move forward. But what could replace it might be worse, right? Or what and so you see, this is an important conversation to have and to open up a space of sort of experimentation in the field of possibility. But you can also see that there are other sort of actors and factions in these conversations who have sort of strongly reactionary points of view about liberalism. So you can, a lot of critiques of liberalism come from far left or far right standpoints. And so for me, the question kind of becomes, how does that synthesis kind of inoculate itself from kind of unhealthy radicalism, whilst also kind of engaging in a fairly radical project of rethinking society?
Yeah.
Is this a conversation you have, or?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about kind of the model, the threat model, sort of, for society ending up in the wrong paradigm as a result of one of these crises. It comes back to this decay process that I mentioned earlier. Like, as you reach the limits of your paradigm, what happens is you run into problems that, you know, you can't solve within paradigm. But there's always this kind of like sociological fact of people trying to demonstrate their allegiance to the paradigm, or trying to like rise within the paradigm, or maybe it's like they're not even trying, but that's what the thing selects for, is the people that kind of keep pushing it. But when you're starting to reach that limit, you get this point where people are trying to apply the old solutions to new problems that they don't apply to, and in fact, the more absurd that is, the more credit they get for doing that. And so it becomes this process of idolatry, actually, in that like biblical sense, where people are taking some principle and just like kind of shoving everything through it. And it ends up being, in some cases, extremely harmful. And I think the further you get along that path towards like this paradigm is now no longer working, the worse it gets in that regard. And then of course institutions start breaking down as a result, and obviously also as a cause of that. And so I think the default trajectory on the current, even within the current paradigm, is actually destruction, right? It's something very evil. So the game is not just to build something better, but even just to get off that path onto a sane path. Now, as for like other ways that it could go, other paradigms, I think there's one thing that can happen is the thing just breaks down, the paradigm breaks down, and you end up going in some other direction that's maybe not very well thought through. Maybe it's not very well structured. It doesn't work very well. In my view, that's largely the result of there's really no one planning it. There's no one kind of designing it to be something that's going to work. No one's sitting there at the center thinking like, all right, now we want to go in this direction. Rather, it's just this emergent process of sort of chaotic conflict between various power centers. They work out some deal. The deal might actually be entirely opposed to the continued progress or even existence of the society. And so it's this very unconscious process. And so that's like the second default trajectory, is you actually get something undesigned that is just chaos. So what we're trying to do is come in and say, okay, let's understand the situation, or understand parts of it enough that we are able to add functionality to whatever comes after. Like, we're trying to do this in a purely positive manner. It's like, okay, they're going to need to understand this. It should come from that perspective of a responsible center. It should, here are the key issues of society that it should be trying to tackle. And so it's this design process, this process of building up functionality and value against these kind of by default destructive outcomes. So that's kind of how I view it. I'm not that worried about, creating some monster that goes the wrong direction, because I think we've kind of carefully designed our whole strategy around kind of taking the positive approach, this constructive approach that isn't like one of the ways you really get those destructive approaches is people say, okay, we're going to take an accelerationist line. We're going to say this system is broken and it needs to be broken further so that it goes away, so that something new can come. But if no one's actually building the new thing, then that's just, you're just gunning the accelerator into the wall.
It
right?
can actually just get worse and worse and worse. And
yes, it can actually just get worse.
I actually, there probably is a bottom, but I suspect that the bottom might just be extinction or something.
Yeah, you don't want to see the bottom, right? You want to turn aside before you get there. And so the approach that we're taking is, we try to be basically rigorously constructive, try to take, we certainly have opinions that like, X needs to be torn down, or we have instincts that direction, right? It's like, this is bad, that's bad. I can only see this thing just needing to be destroyed. But that's not what we're doing with Palladium. What we're doing with Palladium is okay, what's the responsible thing to do here, or the constructive thing to do here? How do we do that instead? And so, this comes into one of our kind of central pieces of governance futurism, which is the idea of embodying a responsible elite center, right? And building up that consciousness. Because that's, as far as I can tell, the only way to get out of something like this is to have at least some group of people who have a clear idea of what's going on, and a clear vision of where they want to steer it, and something that has actually engaged with all the issues, and then they go and implement that. And if you're in that general paradigm of like, you have a regime, the regime is kind of in control, and they kind of have a strategy of where they're going, and they're able to execute that strategy, that's like a very good place to be, right? That's not where the errors come from, I think, in our current situation. Now, obviously, there are also very bad things that can come from that, but I think that's like the more optimistic scenario. And so what we're trying to do is occupy that perspective and say, hey, suppose there's going to be a new center. What's that going to look like? How can we build it? How can we make it better? What problems is it going to have to face? What pitfalls is it going to have? What are the pathologies of going this way or that way? How do we actually just approach that thing from a reflective, kind of in control perspective that is able to recognize its own errors and then course correct, rather than just kind of bungling into something? So that's like the core approach, I would say, to how we deal with that, the sort of threat of getting a bad outcome. It's like the way we're parsing the issue is that we think like the default outcome is basically destruction. You have to construct your way out of that. And in constructing your way out of that, you have to actually occupy something that can steer a civilization. I think one of the flaws that a lot of people have in approaching these things is that they approach it as from this outsider perspective, and they construct their worldviews in a way that makes them a permanent outsider. And you can't actually have a permanent outsider government, right? You can't have a society run on outsider consciousness. It doesn't work, because like, society at some point is a group of people actually going somewhere together. They have to have a conception of who they are and what they want positively, not in reference to some order they're trying to tear down that is above them, but in reference to their own order, which they are building up and trying to create.
Yeah, there's no permanent opposition regime.
Yeah, you can't have a permanent opposition regime. It doesn't work, like even just conceptually. And I think a lot of the flaws of liberalism as it stands now are the degree to which it has picked up this outsider mindset in its elite conception, right? It's, we've got the leftovers of the 60s and that whole kind of social revolution, imagining themselves as, a bunch of young people tearing down the man. Well, the issue is when that kind of succeeds, takes power, what do you get? You get a bunch of old people trying to tear down the man. They're not able to coordinate to be the man and be the man effectively and responsibly. They're not thinking about that. They're not set up to do that. Likewise, I think in the American Revolution, you kind of have, at least how it's been mythologized subsequently, you've got this idea of like, oh yeah, man, we're rising up against the established order. We're tearing down the elites. Like, these evil elites. We just need like enough of the population to get into a revolutionary mindset, and then we'll do the American Revolution again, and it'll be fine. I think that kind of mythology is really harmful, because you can't run a society on that stuff. A society has to be run on some kind of positive vision that imagines itself to be the center. So that's where we're trying to build something, is because we don't see anything else out there that's actually trying to occupy that and actually trying to engage with the problems of the day in an open-minded way. You have to build something in that space. And I think getting in that space versus outside of that space is so huge in terms of getting the good outcomes versus the bad outcomes, that like I'm apart from that, like largely not worried right now. I mean, maybe we'll worry about more problems in the future, but like, let's first get the problem of, are we even running a society here, or are we just kind of fighting each other?
I want to address the fear aspect a little more, Adam. I think the way you phrased your question was like people, tell me if this is correct. It's something like people see a lot of chaos increasingly in the society. They see a bunch of radical movements who are trying to exploit certain divides or certain issues for their own gain. And so there's this fear that kind of like, if you admit that maybe there are contradictions or that maybe there is an actual crisis going on, you basically legitimize their position, and you open the door irreversibly to a bunch of nasty stuff coming in. Like, do you think that's sort of an accurate representation of that fear?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think the added piece that I'm thinking now of is that there's so much potential to amplify voices like that. For better and for worse, we have this kind of new landscape where we have a lot more participants, we have a lot more points of view. In some ways, we can get into why that's true and not true, but there's a way to. I feel like there's more ways to conceive of the future wrongly than there are to do it correctly. And
that's likely true, but I think it's also the case that in a political order or in a regime, whatever term we want to use, we're using the term regime in a sort of functional manner here. All societies live under regimes of some kind or another. Some are good, some are not so good. But when a regime reaches a state of kind of breakdown of the coordination mechanisms that let it function well, we kind of get to a point where there is a breakdown going on. Maybe certain important contradictions in the society have arisen, have become so clear to the point that you now have increasing social conflict. There's a choice here at the very start. You can admit there's a problem, or you don't. And there's always a strong incentive to say there is no problem, right? Because party lines are important for coordinating people with power. When people with power become uncoordinated, a lot of terrible destruction can happen. But there's kind of a point, I think, where that flips. It might be let's look at France, right, at the time of its revolution in 1789. In the early 1780s, the kind of social groundwork for that was already in place. But I'm sure for the most part, it was not really permissible to say, hey, there's a big risk that the king might be overthrown. I'm sure very few people even thought it was going to get to that point. And so everyone's personal incentive is to say, no, there is no problem. There's no fundamental problem. Maybe there's this crisis or that crisis, and we'll figure out how to sort it out. But basically, things are great, and long live the king. And then, comes the moment when I think in general, the way collapses work is that, a lot of the bad fruits come all at once. And so within a very short time, the thing is overthrown, the king is executed, a new regime comes in. But an important thing happens here, right? A lot of people still stay loyal to the king. And so you have royalists all over the country, you have emigre royalists, you have, and these people actually end up getting a restoration at some point. After Napoleon, after all of this happens, a new king comes back, right? Another Bourbon. They have a couple of kings in, they screwed up again. People then used to say the Bourbons had forgotten nothing and forgiven nothing, right? Or remembered nothing and forgiven nothing. They kind of thought that they could kind of time travel back to whatever the last good year was again, and restore the old thing. And in fact, you still had people loyal to that all the way. There is still some now, but through into the 20th century, it was kind of an influential position in sort of hyper-conservative parts of the society, and eventually got to the point where people were like, okay, these people are obviously just kind of myth-making and role-playing. But where was that point, right? Like at some point here, it came to a point where a lot of those people should have realized, you know what, the fundamental things that were in place that made this function are no longer in place. And so even if you have this kind of attachment to the ideals of that regime, and I think that's usually the case, right? When people kind of have, I think a lot of people now, right, and you see this on the right, you see it on the left, they'll kind of pick regimes in history and sort of, live vicariously through them, use their symbols. Use hammer and sickles in the DSA crowd. You'll see kind of certain sort of hyper traditionalist types waving royal emblems or something like that. I think what usually ends up happening in all those cases is that there's an attachment to values. But if we really are concerned about those things, whatever those may be, right? If you're concerned about the family, right, the nuclear family, that kind of mid-century capitalism developed seems to have more or less broken down. There's a lot of bad fallout from this. The rights of labor have been eroded. Housing, right, is not available. There's a bunch of crises in the cities. All of these things are legitimate, and there are visions that we want to see in the society. But in order to get those things to pass, you need to think of yourself, okay, but in the current conditions that we're in, right, what kind of new agreement, what kind of new ways of coordinating, what kind of new social technologies, what kind of new regime can see those things through? And it's probably not going to look exactly like the old regime did, right? Even for the same goals, right? I mean, most people, I think, want to live in a basically peaceful and ordered society. But in a mass industrialized society, the way you get there is kind of different than if you're living in some agrarian, late medieval realm or something like that. And so, to bring this back to the fear question, I think that the reason people have fear is because they believe that if we admit that there is a problem, then something is going to come in that destroys any chance of securing the values that we actually prized. I think the mistake being made here, you know, first of all, I think we are at a point now where we can pretty clearly say, I think it is basically uncontroversial to say that we are no longer able to coordinate on achieving the values that we want to see, right? Whatever those may be, there's disagreements people will have there. But at that point, the first step to securing those values is to say, okay, this thing is no longer working, and we need to figure out a realistic way that we can rebuild something new that can actually secure those things. And here's the thing. If we take our assumption here that there's already been a breakdown and there's already a vacuum open, something will step in, right? This is not a question of whether or not that vacuum opens, at least in our assumptions here. If we don't create the new thing, then someone else will. And so, you get to a point where actually refusing to address this hastens the thing that we're actually afraid of happening rather than stopping it, even though it's maybe a terrifying admission to have to make at the start.
Yeah, that's a really good point. With what we're doing with governance futurism, or just like more generally, the people trying to talk about these issues, we're not the ones opening that vacuum. The vacuum is opening up on its own. And I think actually, like, thinking this through, this fear of talking about it and this fear of any possible alternative to liberalism is actually one of the sort of core commitments of liberalism and one of the core control mechanisms. It says, it's like one of its legitimacy mechanisms is, hey, if you don't do this thing, this kind of like half disabled society where we're not really able to run any particular strong vision, then something really bad might come in, right? Like this is a common story. And I think that's actually part of why the system isn't talking about this right now. It's because actually within that paradigm, within the mainline governance structures, it's not legitimate to be talking about, hey, maybe this thing's failed and we need to start thinking outside of the box, because that box has been one of the very firm sort of axioms of the system. Maybe this is true of all regimes, maybe not, but it's definitely true of this one.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I think you're absolutely right that these are conversations that need to be had. These are ideas that need to be explored, realities that just need to be acknowledged, as you say, the fundamental contradictions in society that are, kind of, I forget exactly what you said, Ash, but it was we lack the ability to sort of collectively coordinate in terms of the values that we actually hold. So at that point, it even becomes a question of it. You have a series of further problems. Not only do you have to identify what values are the right ones and the important ones, but even if you do, you have this huge material coordination problem where kind of even heading in that direction is maybe even foreclosed by the system that you're operating in. And so I think this is hugely important stuff that you both are doing. And I remember this feeling of reading the Palladium articles and participating in one of your salons, and just feeling like the energy coming through is pretty different, especially from the type of stuff that I'm used to reading with a kind of an academic background. And the difference, I think, is that it's the energy you're putting out is bold and speculative. I would even characterize it as sort of optimistic, not really utopian, even if you're kind of, I mean, it gets a little bit science fiction sometimes, the government's future and stuff, not in a kind of like, Hollywood movie sort of way, but in a sort of like, we need to think bigger. We need to kind of remove some of these constraints that we've placed on ourselves that might be imaginary. We need to kind of, to solve some of these crises, we kind of need to step into a level of society and civilization that we currently aren't at and have never achieved before. And so I kind of I really appreciated just the freshness of something feeling kind of just robust and optimistic.
Well, we try to be grim and wild-eyed optimists.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. There's a realism to it, and I'd say that there's you're trading in these sort of high level abstractions that are traded and shift through history, like nature, humanity, technology, sort of these big level concepts. And then at the same time, you're trying to kind of run through the actual like logistics of the machinery of society, you know? So I see you
Mhm.
guys as kind of carrying these two poles where you kind of vacillate between sort of what I think of as like big picture speculative philosophy, which can be grounded in reason and rationality. It's sort of, you know, informed speculation mixed with, you know, on the ground reporting, you know, these kind of more detailed logistical stuff. And it's interesting to me because and I bet you your audience feels the same way, is that you often get a person who's rooted in one or the other of those camps, where when you're kind of doing philosophy and kind of the ontology of the person and society, I'm kind of sitting there like, oh yeah, I know this is the kind of stuff I think about all of the time. But then when you switch gears into like political economy and things like that, I'm like, I'm completely, for me, just reading a lot of new stuff that I'm learning about kind of for the first time. So I love the energy, and I love that you're like you said, that vacuum isn't something that's just opened up because three guys sit down and decide to have a conversation about liberalism and what might come after it, but because it's actually a like a real physical event that's happening all around us,
Mhm.
and we need to kind of participate in first, I think maybe just one act that seems like it might not have much teeth to it, but I think is actually really important, is just actually being consciously present about the fact that it's happening. And just
Right.
before you even go to like diagnosis or prescription, just kind of sitting there and being like, wow, like a lot of there's a lot of stuff going on right now that we're not kind of addressing in a good way. Things are really at stake, you know, lives are at stake, futures are at stake. And just being present to that, I think, is its own kind of difficulty and skill. And then that's what kind of opens up the space of possibilities, kind of just like letting yourself see what's happening. And then, you know, instead of just reacting to it, kind of opening up a space for like, okay, well, this is just kind of what is this is what's happening. Can we take like a kind of adult orientation to it, and move forward in some way, instead of just kind of, you know, retreating into the past, or, you know, letting that fear grip you. And I think what you were saying, Wolf, was so prescient, in that a lot of the sort of control mechanisms of our current society rely precisely on foreclosing thinking about alternatives, because it's
Right.
too dangerous to think about that. And
Mhm.
we that's not really a luxury that we have. And I think if you just let a certain set of sort of more radically minded people into that space, then that's all you're going to get in that space, is those people, because they're the only people who showed up to have those conversations and to
Right.
imagine those differences. So I think that's, I mean, that's just a really nice way of framing kind of where you're at and what you're doing. I'm wondering if we could shift gears just a little bit to kind of talk more about not just the sort of the ideas and the vision, but the sort of different vehicles that we now have available to kind of disseminate, you know, these various kinds of conversations and things like that. We have
Right.
social media, we have the internet. We're doing this remote podcast, you know, in the middle of a pandemic. You have your salons. You just launched the first issue of the print journal that goes along with your online pieces. Where are you at in terms of like Palladium? As I think of it, here's how I think of it. I think of it as a kind of next generation magazine, where I see that you have, you know, on the website, it's been featured in the Atlantic and Bloomberg and, you know, all of these other sort of publications that also circulate online. They also have social media presence. And yet to me, I feel like there's something different about a magazine like Palladium, that it's not quite like Bloomberg or even like a more niche, you know, technology journal. It's kind of its own thing. And I don't know, like, where do you see it going? Like, is the goal to become something like the Atlantic, or do you have a different vision for you kind of what the larger arc of growth is for it?
So there's a few things going on there. I mean, I don't know if we want to tackle kind of the the future of the media landscape. The long story short, I think there's always going to be a place for basically dedicated professional institutions trying to work on some aspect of society's knowledge. Social media is not going to change that. No amount of like tech decentralization or whatever is going to change that. Even going beyond a human paradigm entirely is not going to change that. But as for sort of like why or how Palladium is a little bit different from these other publications structurally, first thing is obviously, like you said, we're a little bit next generation, I guess. We're a little bit more native to the internet. We're all millennials. But I don't think that's necessarily the big difference. I think one of the things that is different between Palladium and established magazines is that we're not just formulated to serve a particular audience and kind of like provide what they're interested in. We're not providing a product on the market. We don't think about it that way at all. And a lot of, I don't know, maybe other magazines also think about it in different ways, but the way that people talk about it is that a magazine is supposed to identify some audience and, create the content that is of interest to that audience. And then it's going to create traffic or subscriptions or whatever. And then, it's a business, or maybe it's selling ads or whatever, right?
To concretize that, we literally never look at our view counts or anything. I literally don't remember the last time I looked at that.
Yeah,
we're more interested.
It's not true that we literally don't ever, but yeah, that's not our metric. Basically,
we're interested in the actual kind of real social infrastructure that it's creating.
Yeah, so a magazine within the liberal model, right, is this object that exists on the market. It's just, maybe it's for profit. It's serving an audience of individuals who have desires. We're not thinking about it like that at all. Our way of thinking about this is we're building an institution, perhaps a set of institutions that are going to embody a new paradigm. And obviously the first thing to get going is your information logistics, right? Your consciousness. You need the brain center of the thing. And that's kind of what we're doing with Palladium, right? Crystallizing kind of the intellectual core of something new. But then, we talk about things like the governance futurism movement, right? The magazine is a magazine of a movement, but not just kind of shilling a pre-cooked perspective, but building a perspective. That the movement is almost about building a perspective, right? It's about kind of this particular type of responsibility for society's ideas. So it's like the magazine is just it's a nucleation point for a larger vision that we have, which is building this network of institutions and building this movement of, very smart, very dedicated people with ideas that are outside of the previous box, but that can embody the next box, so to speak. And I think that kind of publication is pretty rare in history. It's not unheard of. These things have obviously been done. But like we were saying earlier, with respect to our intellectual project, there aren't that many people right now trying to embody a new center. There's a lot of people trying to embody extreme outliers, extreme oppositions. There's a lot of people trying to desperately hold on to the old center and doing gymnastics to mutate it into something that's capable of holding power despite the things that are going on. But there isn't a lot of just directly trying to embody a new center. And I think that's why Palladium feels a little bit unique, because actually the structure of the project is oriented around doing that. And, in the long run, I basically see Palladium as being, one among many respectable kind of publications that are sort of accepted by the center of society as something worth reading. And, maybe we build other things. Maybe we have a larger impact or a large impact in some areas or something. But in terms of what we're trying to do, it might even be that Palladium's job is finished at that point, right? Once Palladium and Palladium way of thinking becomes accepted as mainstream, if it does, perhaps, then maybe that's issue 99 of our print magazine and we're done, right? It's I don't know. I don't know where it will go, but what's needed right now is this intellectual nucleation point for a new way of thinking and a new way of organizing.
Yeah, and I suspect that as this grows, obviously, as more projects are started from this, not necessarily even media projects, right? But people looking at the work of governance, be it city building, be it trying to like figure out how to make better coordination mechanisms, whatever it is, better diplomacy. And I suspect that we will start to see, right, developing Schelling points going on. Maybe some of those will come into dialogue with each other or conflict with each other. But in a sense, I think that will be a sign that we have done our work in the sense of within a paradigm. You're in a paradigm when like a lot of the reference points that you encounter start being themselves from within the same paradigm. Maybe you have arguments over who's the most faithful representative of the paradigm or something like this. But in that sense, I think what we're doing right now is kind of the first elements of a vision that should scale up, that should inform like a very diverse array of things down the road. And in terms of a movement, in terms of a social infrastructure here, I think that kind of is a direct conclusion, right, from what we've talked about earlier. If one of the things that matters most is in fact the social coordination and the vision that it embodies rather than just what it talks about, then that is kind of what you should work on, rather than just focusing on the right ideas, as important as those are.
Mm-hmm. And I think a number of us working in these areas trying to create institutions that are, maybe beginning to be formed online, because the barrier to entry there is so much lower than the costs associated with, needing, lots of technology, land, buildings, staff, like all of that kind of stuff that used to be sort of necessary for even doing, projects on the scale of what I'm doing with the side view. It's very recently that you could kind of run something like this from your office at home and kind of have it gain some traction. The question, of course, is how do you go from like essentially being a website that people visit and generating conversation on social media and so on? How do you go from there into kind of properly multi-generational kind of institutions that also interact in the real world in a different way? And for me and for a lot of people in that space, we're thinking about that jump, especially in terms of like what's the economics of these new institutions? Like, how do they become sustainable? How do they kind of fend for themselves as kind of sovereign economic kind of entities, in that sense that if they're going to avoid, like, if you're not watching your your page view metrics, if you're not watching your social media impressions, if you're not going for advertising revenue, like what are some of the ways that people could kind of like sort of bootstrap their way up, like into something like Palladium, into something like what you guys are doing? Do you have thoughts on how that works? Do you have conversations on how to grow out from where you are? And people who are looking to do something like you're doing, like, do you have advice for them? Because I think what you're doing is not just worth sort of following, but worth kind of looking at. Like, because there's a lot of people out there who would like to see alternatives like Palladium, and I'm sure that they would really appreciate just hearing some of, like, how do you think about that? How do you think about sustaining a project like this and like living lives?
I mean, the first thing is about the internet. You mentioned now we have the internet available, and we don't have to go to this great expense of having physical locations and so on. I sort of think about it like, we don't have those things available anymore, and now we have to resort to the internet. It's sort of like the opposite story in a way. And I think, inherently there isn't a lot of funding for stuff going on outside of the paradigm, right? That's just how it works. And if you have a lot of funding because you've figured out some genius business model, in terms of having a big audience or something, it's probably because you're actually conforming yourself to the existing paradigm. So yeah, there's inherently this issue, which is like, it's kind of hard to think outside the box, especially when society doesn't really want to think outside the box, especially when society is in a particularly dysfunctional mode. and that's just sort of this material kind of economic aspect. And I think our theory of how to fund things like Palladium is that they're inherently nonprofits. In fact, all media is kind of going to a nonprofit model right now, and if not overtly and honestly, in the sense that every now and then some billionaire buys the thing out and subsidizes it to push their perspective for a while, and it loses money for many years, and then they sell it to some ex-billionaire or like just refinance it or something. Like basically the product of these things, of an intellectual object, is not just, especially in a space as sort of fluid as the internet. The product is not that you're supplying information to consumers that they can't get otherwise. It's that you're building up the prestige and availability of a particular viewpoint that someone has interest in creating. And, for now, maybe that's only us that have interest in creating this particular viewpoint. And there aren't that many people with means who appreciate it. But that's at the beginning, right? At the beginning, you're small and scrappy. You haven't proven yourself. It's a new paradigm, or it's potentially a new paradigm. It's outside the box. There shouldn't necessarily be a lot of funding for that stuff, and there really isn't. But though, as for like how you build it up and how you kind of become more established, it's just, you do a little bit of work with a little bit that you're able to kind of scrape together at the beginning, and you do enough to convince people that it's worth taking seriously. You do enough to sort of build up the prestige of that kind of thing, and in particular that project. And as that project gains prestige, and as it executes well, and as it delivers on what it's supposed to be doing, more people get interested in it. More people want to get involved. More people want to support it, because again, it's the kind of thing that they want to see in the world. And that's the actual funding structure of something like this. So that's kind of, it's just this compounding snowball of returns of kind of building the right thing, having taste, building the right thing, and then having this persuasion snowball as people kind of come to believe that that is the right thing to do and that it's worth supporting. And eventually, maybe you become one of the things within the new paradigm that actually is more dominant in society. And then, funding is basically no problem, as funding is no problem for sort of the perspective of the current system. And so I think that's just how it works, right? It's like you're inherently a little bit outside. It's a little bit entrepreneurial. It's scrappy. You have to kind of do well with very little because of just the inherent structure of society. And I don't know if that really, I guess that's a very abstract answer. More concretely, as we have thought from the beginning of this thing as building up a movement, building up a new audience, building up people who are going to be really interested in this, we operate on a subscription model that, basically we get people to subscribe to us in the sense of supporting us charitably, essentially. They support us on Patreon basically right now, and various other means. And in return, we kind of give them perks. We give them access to our podcast. We give them now the Palladium print edition that'll be coming out hopefully quarterly as we get our feet under us. And that just sort of, it helps establish the relationship and so on. But really what's going on there is we're building up a movement of people who want to see this kind of thing in the world and building a relationship with them. And then we're supporting each other in producing it.
If I could jump in there, Wolf, you're basically, it's a relationship of mutual faith in one another, essentially. Like that is why you can't quite think of this economically, at least not in an orthodox sense, because you are, people are investing in you. They're giving to you because they have faith in what you're doing. You are providing them value in turn because you have faith in them that they're going to stick around with you. They're going to participate however they're participating. And, obviously, hopefully they increase that participation and giving as time goes on. But that's why it's a relationship. You and they should be growing in that together. And I think that if you embrace the fact that what a project like this is not really a traditional business, that is what you really do need to go with.
Yeah, and actually on that point of like our relationship with the audience and the sort of mutual faith, that goes just part of why we've kind of been selective with our audience. We've kind of deliberately aimed for a relatively small but high potential set of people to be reading us, and those are the people we want to kind of form that relationship with, where they're supporting us a little bit and we're supporting them and betting on their future, right? Like, one of the things we're doing with Palladium is not just that, we're delivering some product to some audience, but that we're trying to empower our audience with information that is going to help them make the impact that we are mutually sort of developing together, and to build the future that we are imagining together, right? So we're wanting to be selective with our audience, get the people who are actually the ones that we are confident kind of sending out into the world with our ideas.
Yeah, if you don't have faith in your audience, this is not going to work, right?
And
I think so, that's like step one.
Yeah, that's why we hold our audience to a high intellectual standard. We actually invite them into our internal conversations and try to understand things with them, try to build up their understanding of things. That's not just us delivering a product, that's us investing in a particular future.
Yeah.
There is one other, if I were going to compare the economic model here somewhat, it would actually be to financial institutions in a weird way, in the sense that, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been this hollowing out of mid-level financial institutions. And so banks, hedge funds, institutionals, and so on. And so we have at the top this kind of, a number of huge organizations that provide a lot of liquidity, that are very established. And importantly, they're the ones that, make financial legitimacy legible in a way, right? Like, if you have a relationship with these organizations, you're legit. And, you kind of see the same thing in the media, right? I think that, like a lot of these banks, you look at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they're too big to fail, right? Like, this is how you read political legitimacy, right? If they take you seriously, you are legit. And if you are in a position of granting legitimacy, I think you are almost by definition too big to fail, right? There are a lot of interested stakeholders who are going to make sure that you keep on granting them legitimacy. Now, the other side of that, obviously this doesn't quite apply to us. The other side of that is there are a number of financial institutions that have very niche services that they play, or that they fulfill, right? So you have like hedge funds that lose money on gaming companies, right? Little things that not everyone can do. And so you, likewise, I think with an intellectual project, you're going to be fulfilling an important niche somewhere, right? There's going to be some kind of real value that you are providing that people have not realized yet. And you might be wrong about what you think you're providing, or you might be wrong about the value, right? With all those kinds of things, there's a high failure rate. You kind of are probably going to fail as you go into it. But if you do find that niche, like a stable niche, then there's ways you can find to scale that up. And I think what we've just been talking about with the relationship with an audience, I think that is one of the ways that you scale in that position and doing the kind of work that we're doing. And so, it's that mid-level, right? To become moderately successful or something doing that is in a way the most unstable position, because it kind of shows you've tapped out the gains, or at least you think you have, but you haven't really achieved the level where you're indispensable. And so, that's kind of what you want to avoid. Maybe you want to rethink your niche if that's where you're stopping, right? You go kind of 0 to 1 the thing. So, for people who want to link it back to kind of other industries or more traditional economic models, that's one I would go with.
Nice. This was a really great conversation, guys, and I think this is maybe a good point to maybe introduce a few ways that if people want to support Palladium, get onto that subscription, check out the print issue. I've seen some photos of it online. It looks really amazing. I'm really happy that you guys are still in print. There's a fair number of people I've interacted with who kind of feel like, well, why would you go into print when you have online and digital space? And I think that
they don't get it.
They don't really get it. There's something really important about just being able to have that kind of standalone artifact, especially like you're saying, Wolf, like you have the a little bit of taste and style to kind of pull it off in a way that really enriches the content. Then that's still the best way to read. Like, let's be honest,
print is real, right?
It just is.
Yeah, the revealed preference here is that I think if you ask almost any writer if they want to go into print, they will say yes.
Yeah.
Like people, the internet for us is not quite as real as that. And I don't, maybe it will become more like that equivalent of real. I don't know.
Right.
But if all the servers go down and the wires beneath the sea are cut, right, then all of that is gone. And maybe it's the people who did a few print magazines and lost a bunch of money on them who end up being read in the monasteries in 2,000 years.
Well, I think there's something to what you're saying. And I think it also actually connects to, I love this idea of like a shared future, a kind of a participatory relation with your audience. You're kind of growing together in a direction to kind of create something that doesn't currently exist. But I think also the reason that a book or a print journal is interesting is that it kind of it's broken off from the rest of the world, as you say, in the same way that there was I noticed a little bit of a shift that was probably accelerated by the COVID situation, by the pandemic, and kind of accelerated digitization of everything, where there was more of a priority placed on not sharing everything that was happening, of like creating sort of little disconnected groups that like,
right.
So like not everything is available everywhere all of the time. There's like putting a little membrane behind it, around it, can actually create a better, deeper, more enduring conversation. And I think that's why books are the same. Like when you commit to like creating one issue of a thing, then you've also committed to stop, like the development has stopped. You can stay in like perpetual sort of bootstrapping developmental incrementalism for forever, and the online world enables that. But in print, you're kind of saying, this is like, at least for right now, this is my definitive statement about this.
This is done.
And it's done. And I'm moving on to something else. And you can say what you want about that because it's not going to change now. It's there.
Yeah.
So I really like that.
That's why we put a lot of thought into even the materials that we used for the thing and the design important. And everything. Like the whole, as we talked about the institutions communicating the ideology, even with the print, right? This physical artifact communicates what you find important.
Right. Right. So why don't we close out by just, letting people know how can they find both of you online? How can they find access to subscription prints? I don't know how you do your community salon. I think you have an email subscription.
So the site itself is palladiummag.com. And if people are interested in supporting or joining the community salons, our podcast now, our second half is available to subscribers, and they can find that info at palladiummag.com/subscribe. And we're both on Twitter as well. Yes. So print magazine is available for the $50 a month tier and up. And again, all of that info, palladiummag.com/subscribe. And if you want to talk to us, we're both on Twitter. The magazine is at Palladium Mag. I'm at Milton Wrights. And Wolf, you're just at Wolf Tivy, right?
That's right.
Okay. Do you want to add anything else there?
No, that's
cool.
A good summary of how to get involved. I mean, as for like getting involved in the internal conversations and so on, first of all, just come talk to us. Second of all, obviously, we invite all our subscribers.
Yeah, and we communicate kind of like the day-to-day. We have a Slack for our supporters. It's very lively and conversational, and then we get together every week basically for an internal off-the-record community salon, Chatham House rule, and they're really great. We had one this last week on kind of the weird way that the prices are becoming political signals. Yeah, jumped off the GameStop thing, but it went into like really interesting rabbit holes. So I definitely it's one of the best things I think in the last year now that we really got off the ground. I've had a ton of fun with the salons.
Nice. Great. All right, Wolf, Ash, thanks so much for being here. This is a great conversation, and best of luck to both of you with everything.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks,
so
Adam.
much for having us.